Across the globe, justice systems are being reimagined through trauma-informed care, desistance theory, and neuroscience. At the forefront of this movement stands a voice for change, a trainer of professionals, and a storyteller committed to evidence-based reform. This is The Criminologist, the podcast exploring the people, the practices, and the possibilities shaping a more humane justice system. And now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 238 of The Criminologist Podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. If you've listened to this show for any length of time, you know we talk about desistance and desistance from crime quite a bit. We talk about how people exit a life of crime and delinquency, how change happens, and what it takes to build a different kind of future. And today, we're taking another look at that process. Not just how desistance begins, but how it is sustained over time. Because one of the questions we don't always ask in this field is, what does long-term desistance from crime actually look like? My guest today, Paul Doke, is a PhD candidate at Liverpool John Moores University, and his work builds upon Shadd Maruna's Liverpool Desistance Study, one of the most important contributions to our understanding of desistance from crime. But Paul is asking a different question. Not just how people, quote unquote, make good, but how they stay good. His research focuses on identity, recovery, and belonging among long-term members of Narcotics Anonymous. Individuals who have sustained desistance from crime and substance use, not just for 5 years, but in some cases, for decades. And in doing so, he challenges a key assumption in our field. The idea that 5 years of abstinence represents stable recovery. Because when we talk about desistance from crime, what happens after that? Where do long-term desisters go once they disengage from the system? And what can we learn from individuals who have maintained desistance over 10, 20, even 40 years? This is a conversation about the long arc of desistance from crime, about identity, recovery, and what it truly means to build and sustain a life beyond offending. So, without further ado, I invite you to sit back, relax, please enjoy my conversation with Paul Doke, and I'll see you all on the other side. Paul, welcome to The Criminologist. Why don't you introduce yourself, maybe tell our listeners a little bit about the early chapters of your journey, and then we'll pick up the conversation around your views and experiences around the topic of desistance from crime.
Hey, thanks very much for the invite. It's really kind of you. Hello, everybody. My name's Paul Doke. At this present moment in time, I'm a 40-year PhD student at Liverpool John Moores University here in the United Kingdom. A little bit about my background. I'm just like an average kid who got caught up in the criminal justice system in the late 70s, early 80s. I was trapped in a lifestyle and a cycle of prolific criminality and chaotic substance misuse until I got clean in 2011. After I got clean, I really struggled sort of like fitting back into society. I didn't know how to use a computer. I didn't know how to do all the basic functions, like I didn't have a bank account, bank cards, driving license, emails. I was sort of like stuck in a Fred Flintstone era.
I love the Flintstones reference, and it really does speak to some of those unseen struggles of reintegration, Paul. Maybe talk a little bit more about those.
So the first thing I had to do was learn how to operate in this new space without my beer goggles on, so to speak. So I went back to college and signed up for a basic English and maths, and was surprised to find that I was still pretty much switched on. I got clean in November 2011. I couldn't use a touchscreen phone. I signed up for a college in February 2012, and they asked me to do a basic English and maths to give them sort of like a little benchmark or some sort of parameter to let them know where I was at. So they gave me 45 minutes to do each one, 90 minutes to do both. I completed both of them in 35 minutes and scored above 95% on both of them. I was surprised to learn that the way I'd lived my life and the things I'd done to my body hadn't completely fried all my brain cells. That was like my very first accomplishment, and I thought, wow, what else can I do? So I just signed on for something else, and it set off a domino effect whereby I just kept doing course after course after course after course, found myself doing voluntary work for the organisation, intervened and signposted me to the treatment centre where I first got clean. Felt as though I was in a good position to give them some of my time. And it was from there I started to think, do you know what? I always wanted to go to uni when I was a young boy. Because I left school in 1984, and it was a little bit after the Falklands War, and all my friends were getting paid to jump onto planes and shoot people, but I was too young. But that was my dream, to go into the army. My second dream was to go to university. But one poor decision in a party when I was 15 sucked me into the criminal justice system, and all my dreams about university evaporated. All my dreams about going in the army evaporated. And I just found myself in an environment where I had to become something I needed to become to alleviate the trauma of the spaces I found myself in the criminal justice system. And even when I got out the criminal justice system and I'm in the criminal fraternity, I had a really long journey of chaotic substance misuse and prolific criminality. From my drug use, it escalated to abnormal levels in the mid-80s. It didn't fluctuate in any way, shape or form until I got clean in 2011. So that's basically my story. So once I got clean and I started getting these little accomplishments, it was like lighting me up and lifting me up, and it was inspiring me to search for something different. Okay, I've done that. What can I do next? And I found myself going to university. I put in to do my bachelor's in criminology and psychology, and I went to Liverpool John Moores University in 2015 to begin my university journey. I did criminology and psychology as a bachelor's, and I was 48 years of age when I got to university to start my bachelor's. I graduated that in 2018. I was 52.
Wow.
I went right into my master's, did a back-to-back master's, a 1 year intense full-time study. Graduated that in 2019. And the plan was to roll straight into a PhD. I graduated November 2019, and rumours about COVID or stuff going on in China was surfacing at that time. So all the PhD windows got shut down. I think the state, all the governments and all the state powers, they knew about lockdown 6 months before lockdown happened. It just got announced in March 2020. But I think they knew when all these rumours first started surfacing before Christmas 2019. So I continued. At that time, I was working with high-risk offenders on the social justice pathway. That was working with a specific type of offender. In other words, high-risk offenders are those people who are deemed too high risk to go into a conventional hostel setting, so they needed specialised 24-hour support. That was the type of facility I was working at that time when COVID started. And it was funny because over here in England, we call it the MAPA protocols. And MAPA is an acronym that stands for Multi-Agency Public Protection Arrangements. So because I'd been in academia for like 5 years and done my bachelor's and my master's, I was really up to date on what MAPA was, what it meant, what its obligations, what its purpose was. So working on this social housing pathway with high-risk offenders, I was working in an environment with individuals that we couldn't just go into work and say, "Hi guys, Boris says that we've got to go home, be good while we're away." Do you know what I mean? There'd have been no project left so we carried on working. At that point in time, I'm going to paint a little metaphorical picture. So I was like the middleman between the offender and the MAPA framework. The offender wants something, he comes to me, and I've got all my points of contact with the relevant parts of the MAPA framework. So I go into work in March 2020 with one hat on. I was just wearing the hat of the middleman, that's it, nothing else. But within 6 weeks, I was juggling 7 hats because everywhere just closed down. And I mean everywhere. Probation officers went home, you couldn't get face-to-face. You couldn't get direct contact with them on the phone. You could phone them up, but you had to leave voicemails and hope on a wish and a prayer for them to phone you back. Financial institutions where the clients get their money, everywhere shut down. So I suddenly became one and everything to these clients. I'm sort of like sitting there watching all this happen. As an academic, we all have this little dark corner in the back of our head. It's like our research and development department, where we've got a little social scientist that sits on a stool, rubbing his hands together when he sees all types of funky stuff going on in the world. And that's the guy that inspires us to do what we do. Mm-hmm. So I've seen all these struggles by my colleagues and by the clients, and I'm sitting there like responding to it in a professional way, obviously, but the social scientist in the back of my mind was sitting there saying, this is excellent. This is something to write about. So I sat there and I thought, And my first thought, I'll be honest, my very first thought was, why is this happening in a first world country? Did we not learn nothing of Taiwan in the 90s when they had a SARS pandemic? Why have we not got the same protocols that they've got? Because COVID didn't impact Taiwan the way it impacted the rest of us, because they'd already experienced SARS.
Right.
And they'd already mitigated for repetition of such an event. But it's as though like Europe, Britain, America have all been sitting there with the blinkers on thinking that they know better and it'll never happen to them. So I was fascinated by it. I was thinking, wow. So I got myself a proposal together, got in touch with the CEO of the organisation I was working with, the national organisation, by the way. Spoke to the CEO and said, listen, this is what I'm seeing. I've seen the absolute collapse of the MAPA framework. These are the struggles. And I painted a picture for him and said, this is something that needs looking at. I said, can I send you a proposal over? I said, because I'd like to put in for funding to do a PhD and investigate this. So they supported me. And I got the funding and I started my PhD in 2022. Unfortunately, at the time, they pulled the plug 22 months in. But on reflection, I now say, fortunately, they pulled the plug, because what I'm doing now, I believe, is what I was always meant to do. It didn't happen by happenstance.
Paul, I want to, first of all, commend you for sharing that story. Your journey was very enlightening. And I want to comment on something you just said when you said, this is what I was meant to do. As you're obviously aware, and the desistance research is abundant in pointing out the role of identity and identity transformation in the desistance process. And I was going to ask you, as you were telling your story, when you talked about how when you first got those sort of high marks in the 90th percentile, that sounds like almost like surprised you, like, well, I never really considered myself an academic. I thought to myself, well, maybe Paul's going through identity ambivalence, if you will, that you never saw yourself in that role. And now you're stating that, well, yeah, this is always what I was meant to be. And you know this too, Paul, in the desistance research, they talk about, well, you know, my offending self, that wasn't the real me. The Paul Doke I'm talking to now is the real you. Can you maybe point out some instances, Paul, where you had sort of that identity shift taking place from somebody who uses, somebody who offends, to somebody who is a college student, somebody who's getting a master's degree, and now somebody who is, again, doing this work that you felt you were always meant to do? Were there sort of milestones there, or whether you saw the needle in hindsight, sort of that identity needle sort of shifting?
If we just put the stick into reverse for 1 second, and let's go back to when I left school, right? I took 9 exams and passed all 9 with a couple of A's, B's, and a couple of C's. I always enjoyed learning and schoolwork and stuff. But my little soiree into the world of criminal justice and all things immoral sort of put that person asleep, for want of a better saying. And a different part of me emerged, right, that needed to survive the space I was in. So when I got clean, it was as though that part of me that went asleep started to wake up slowly again, if that makes any sense.
It makes total sense. Yeah. And I think you're doing a great job of debunking a lot of myths that the layperson has about justice impacted individuals. And they don't realize, as you're articulating, that so many times, as you described it, these detours into criminality are just that. They're a temporary detour. But I think society, unfortunately, gets into this us, they type thing where they wrongly assume, well, this is your destiny. You're born to be a criminal. You're born to offend. And as you're pointing out, no, it's a couple of missteps here, and suddenly I went down this pathway into substance misuse and criminality, but that was never the real authentic me.
I agree with you. I agree, but I would describe the real authentic me was the person I became, was not the person my parents brought me up to be.
Okay.
I just became something different to survive an episode in my life that, okay, it lasted for a few decades, but I became something I needed to become to survive the episode I was traversing. And then I've come out the other end of it, and then, surprisingly enough, I took them really basic English and maths exams and knocked them right out of the park. And the euphoric recall I got of that sense of accomplishment inspired me to say to the teacher, I want to stay here. What else can I do? Just put me in a class, tell me what to learn. And it set something off. It set the ball rolling again. And, you know, so I've read all of the desistance literature about the spoiled self and the spoiled identity and all the rest of it. And I agree with some of it and a lot of it, or most of it, resonates with my story to some extent. But when I said before, I believe I'm doing what I always meant to be, you sort of like stopped me. So when I was on that social justice pathway, and I'm looking at the map of framework, the best example at that time for me to look at was the Through the Gate agenda by the British government. So that was like an initiative that was rolled out by the British government that sort of encompassed and rolled up all the different types of interventions and specialist support mechanisms into one neatly, pretty tightly packed package that was meant to solve the problems for everyone justice-wide. It didn't actually do that. I remember my supervisor said, right, okay, we want a systematic literature review, because, it got proposed in 2012 in a white paper. It got installed, right, and got activated in 2015, and it got shut down as a failure in 2020. Okay, so it only had a 5-year shelf life. So I had to do a systematic review on everything that had ever been wrote about it. And I remember doing this systematic review, and it took me 14 months to write it. And my supervisor said, "You're okay?" And I said, "Yeah." And he went, "You don't sound very convinced." And I said, "Yeah." I said, I'm just getting a little bit annoyed about something. He went, "What?" And I went, "I keep coming across this term, stable recovery." I said, "And it's really needling me. It's really getting under my skin." He went, "Why?" I said, I'm like 12 years into recovery. It's talking about stable recovery in 5 years. I said, that is, to me, someone who's in recovery walking this path of abstinence. I said, that's just ridiculous. And they went, "Why?" So I started to explain. And they went, "Okay, well, get to the bottom of it, find out where it come from." So it came from a Betty Ford clinic in 2007.
Oh.
And since they sort of broadcast it, it's just being picked up by everybody. And I had a sort of a little bit of a contention against that term, right? Because desistance and recovery is not linear and it's not static.
Right.
It's a fluid concept that's constantly moving, and you're either moving in a positive direction or you're backsliding into a negative direction. You are never treading water. It's a constantly evolving concept. So the idea of like stable recovery, which is also backed up by Shapland's and Bottom's concept of an exit point.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, this is what it screamed to me. I said to my supervisors, I said, "You know what that says to me?" And they went, "What?" I said, "They're inadvertently rubber stamping 5 years as you are fixed, right, and pushing back out into the world."
Mm-hmm.
I said, and it's sort of justified and backed up by Shapland and Bottoms, right, who suggest that, like, at 5 years, you can leave the desistance cycle and adopt your transformed crime-free identity, as though the stuff that happened to you prior,
right,
didn't even happen to you.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there and I'm like, that just sounds so ridiculous to me. I said, I don't like it.
Yeah, and that's one of the conundrums, if you will, about desistance research is to your point, Paul, sort of how do you define something that is so fluid and so ongoing? I mean, maybe an illustration that might resonate with the listeners more is if you think about, say, the common struggles around even, for example, somebody who quits cigarette smoking. And you would say, well, okay, you haven't smoked in a week. Are you considered a former smoker now, or 2 weeks, or a month, or a year? Yeah, it's really hard to pin that down without, as you said, almost giving license to, well, yeah, this 5-year span by definition defines desistance. And it almost reminds me of For example, I know that in correctional agencies, there's even disagreement about, well, how do we refine recidivism? What does that look like? Is it a year? Is it 5 years? Is it not committing a felony or a misdemeanor? And I think, we get so bogged down sometimes in this desire to have a label we can slap on something to say, yep, this is called stable recovery, and that's the benchmark we can use. And it's just more complex than that. Well, I wanted to ask you, I want to roll up our sleeves, really look at your academic work here, which, if I'm not mistaken, builds directly on Shadd Maruna's landmark Liverpool Desistance Study, which, as many listeners know, went on to be the basis of his amazing book, Making Good, How Ex-Convicts Reform and Rebuild Their Lives. I'm holding a signed copy of that in my hands as we speak, Paul. But maybe inform our listeners about, first, Shadd's landmark Liverpool Desistance Study, and then how you are sort of building on that foundational work as part of your dissertation.
I noticed you just said you've got a signed copy of the Making Good book.
I do. I had the honor of meeting Shadd on a trip that I took to Scotland with a group of students. I actually met Shadd Maruna and Fergus McNeil on the same visit here. To my brother in desistance, so good to finally meet you in person, Shadd.
All it's missing is a signature of one of the participants.
Exactly.
Send the book over to me and I'll sign it for you.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
I was one of his participants. I first met Shadd in 1995 when I was on a drug treatment and testing order. And I ended up being one of the participants on his study.
Oh, okay.
I remember writing my master's in 2019. And what I did, for my master's, I'll send you a copy of it. For my master's, what I did was I wrote an autoethnographical dissertation around my own lived experiences.
Oh, brilliant.
And I remember coming across the Liverpool Desistance Study in my perusal of all the literature and stuff. And I remember sitting there like that, and I'm reading it, and I'm like, nah. And I'm just having these moments, and I'm like, nah, it can't be. Because I remember going to the drug treatment testing order, and they said to me, Paul, do you want to earn yourself £5 and a free bus ticket? Now, £5 in 1995 is worth like £30-40 now.
Right.
So I said, what do I have to do? Right. Bear in mind, I'm a flat-out heroin addict, right? And as soon as he said to me £5, that gave me the morning off from Grafton straight away. Said, what do I need to do? Sign me up. He said, you just need to speak to this guy. And I remember this long-haired, hippie-looking guy. And he's come in and he went, hi, my name's Shadd. And I said, okay. And so he told me what the study's about. And I'm like, you're kidding, aren't you? And he went, no, I'm serious. And I went, why is some yank from Chicago in Liverpool wanting to question smackheads? Don't you have any smackheads in America? And I remember having a laugh with him about it, right?
Right.
But I did the study and anyway, I'm sitting there in 2019 and I'm looking at this study and I'm like, and I'm remembering this conversation and I'm like, surely it can't be. Anyway, I said to one of my colleagues now, I said, I was in his study. I said, do you know him? He went, yeah. I said, send him an email and ask him if he was interviewing people in the probation drug treatment and testing centre. I said, because I'm sure I've met him and I'm sure I'm a participant in that study. Anyway, it transpired, it was. Me and Shadd have since been close, especially since he's moved back to Liverpool. I was with Shadd on Friday. We meet up regular, but yeah, the Liverpool Desistance Study, we've had a lot of chats about his work and a lot of chats about the gap that I identified. So going back to the stable recovery benchmark, I'm looking at this now and I had like a real point of discomfort around it. I'm not saying it's right and I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying, as an individual who's got a right to choose whether he's comfortable with something or whether he's not, I'm not comfortable with it. I'm not saying it's wrong or there's anything bad about it. I can see how it's pertinent and how it's useful for certain spaces and for stakeholders and for investors, etc., without going into all that. I'm looking at this stable recovery mark, and so I turned around to my supervisor and I said, I've looked at all the desistance literature, I've looked at all the capital literature, I've looked at all the resettlement and the rehabilitation literature, I've done a systematic review on the through the gate agenda. I said, and you know the one thing I can't find? I said, it's really pissed me off. I said, because I've put a lot of effort into getting noticed by criminal justice. I said, people like me who've exceeded that 5-year mark, no one's writing about them. If that stable recovery benchmark is to be believed, does that mean all my problems go away at 5 years? Do I not face struggles, tensions, anxieties? Do you know what I mean? Do I have to navigate similar problems? I said, who's writing about this stuff? I said, so according to the literature, it's as though aliens have come down and plucked people like me who've gone beyond that 5-year mark. They've plucked them off the planet. Where have they gone? Who's talking about them?
Right.
Who's mapping their journeys out? What happens temporally, on a temporal basis to people at 10 years, 15, 20, 30, 40 years? Who's talking about this? And nobody was.
That's such a great opportunity for you to explore, Paul, because to your point, not only is nobody looking at that, but it's just sort of this forgotten population, if you will, that's just really invisible to researchers and policymakers. Again, it's as if they think, well, we've got to that 5-year mark, out of sight, out of mind. And you raise, again, sort of another one of the conundrums with desistance research is that by definition, it's longitudinal research. You need the passage of time almost to make your points and to make your case. And that's sort of that double-edged sword. So I applaud you for looking at that cohort of individuals who have exceeded that 5-year so-called stable recovery mark. Have you gained any insights, or are you able to share even any assumptions on what that trajectory looks like after that 5-year mark, whether it's stabilizing?
So what I wanted to look at in particular, because you mentioned the word longitudinal. Mm-hmm. So for like the likes of ethics committees and peer reviewers, etc., there needs to be a predetermined point of accountability, right, to substantiate the reliability of the research. You can't just turn around and say, this is Joe, this is Paul. Joe's been clean for 15 years and Paul's been clean for like 12 and a half. How do we know that's true?
Right.
So a longitudinal study has set criteria that sort of justifies the longitudinal nature of the study.
Right.
In my experience, a lot of the people that I know that have remained abstinent for such extended long periods of time, they all belong in 12-step fellowships.
Right.
I haven't met many people in contemporary society who stay abstinent without being involved with some sort of community. So myself, as a member of the Narcotics Anonymous Fellowship, and what makes it sort of it validates the research is because the members of the fellowship, it's a global wide fellowship, and we celebrate our milestones each year. So what I decided to do was I thought, right, okay, we need to map this out.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there has been some research. William White's done a lot of research on Narcotics Anonymous. There's been other studies done on Narcotics Anonymous, but they've all been done from an outsider's perspective.
Right.
Robert Merton wrote a paper called Insiders and Outsiders, and what he was speaking about, he was explaining, the potential for insider and outsider work, etc., etc. And one term that jumped out at me in that piece of work is he says, you do not necessarily have to be Caesar to know Caesar.
I love that.
That's what Robert Merton said, and what he was more or less alluding to was the fact that, like, okay, right, you don't have to be part of a certain space or a certain community to know that community. However, this is one of the rare instances where a lot of research is being done on Narcotics Anonymous, but it's being done by outsiders, and a lot of it is like, it's theoretical and it's intellectualized work and it's observational.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Me being an active member of this fellowship, I'm part of that community. Right? So I was able to recruit fellow members to help me map out and make sense of people's journeys at different temporal stages. So what I did, I recruited 10 active members of Narcotics Anonymous. So if you remember, my point of contention was 5 years. So the period between 5 years and 10 years, it's not as important, but it's still relevant because it's beyond 5 years.
Right.
So I recruited an equal spread of men and women, so I got 2 addicts between 5 and 10. I recruited 4 addicts, 2 men, 2 women, between 11 and 20. And I recruited 4 addicts, 2 men, 2 women, between 21 and 40 years. And I interviewed them using a free association interview technique, because I'm of the belief that quite often researchers, and we're all guilty of it, me as well. We are all guilty of it, right? Me as well. This is the only time I've sort of like thought and looked at it differently. Research is sort of like fly into these spaces, interview people, offer a widely accepted, worn out, in my opinion, format, semi-structured interview format, right? And to get people to talk about certain things in a specific order that's useful to the researcher. And they're not allocating narrative proprietorship of the story to the storyteller.
Yeah.
So these members of Narcotics Anonymous, I think everyone's quite aware that, like, they share their experience, strength, and hope.
Yeah.
And some of them speak at big events and they're talking for like an hour, maybe 90 minutes about, what did it used to be like, what happened, and what's it like now?
Yeah.
So the experience, so you've got experience, strength, and hope. The experience alludes to what did it used to be like. The strength part alludes to what happened to initiate the change, right? And the hope part is, and what's your life like for you now?
Yeah.
So this is how I've interviewed people, and I've sort of like gave them license because they're all very skilled orators in and of themselves in their own right. In order to stay clean, they have to attend meetings and they have to share their experience, strength, and hope on a weekly basis. So they're all very skilled orators at sort of telling their own stories. So I wanted them to tell their own stories in a way that makes them comfortable. Mm-hmm. And order it in a way that makes sense to them. Mm-hmm. And then I'll analyse what they give me.
Paul, I love that you brought up Narcotics Anonymous for several reasons, up to and including the fact that sort of the way you're reframing the value added of Narcotics Anonymous. So when I was starting my journey, really getting into the world of training and evidence-based practices. At least here in America at the time, there was a raging debate about what is considered an evidence-based practice. And I remember having a conversation with a gentleman who I respected greatly, saying that, well, by the textbook definition of an EBP or an evidence-based practice, 12-step groups such as AA or NA don't fit that definition because at the time, at least, we in the risk, need, responsivity world had a fixation on things needing to be cognitive-based interventions, CBTs, and the 12-step programs, therefore, were almost sort of looked down on as, oh, this is just talk therapy. They're not embracing the cognitive model. But what that argument didn't do, and I was taking copious notes as you spoke, was look at the other value of these groups, up to including, of course, you're looking at NA as a fellowship, and belonging is critical in the desistance process, but where you don't see things like belonging or hope are in risk, need, responsivity world. So I love how you've sort of repurposed that and said, okay, through your old school lens of what an EBP is, because like I said, they're maybe not considered cognitive-based programs, but they're instilling hope and they're creating that sense of belonging, which when we look at, for example, primary desistance, secondary desistance, and the ultimate goal of tertiary desistance, that's where that fellowship and that belonging really takes hold. People need that community. They need that tribe. So I applaud you for looking at these programs through that lens, Paul.
I'm not looking at Narcotics Anonymous per se, right? I've got no right to do that. Right? We've got very strict, we call them guidelines, right? In the academic world, we'd call them protocols, very, very strict guidelines, right? So I can't speak for Narcotics Anonymous. That's not my right, and I'm not trying to do that. All I'm trying to do is sort of delineate, make sense of and map out the issues, the tensions, the struggles, the obstacles that some members of the Narcotics Anonymous Fellowship have encountered at different temporal moments, right? And I'm sure if you went to any of the 12-step fellowships and plucked 10 similar individuals, you'd get similar sort of responses from them. So I'm not talking about NA per se. I'm just sort of like utilising my insider status as an active Narcotics Anonymous member, right? Who's got a terrain of lived experience at my disposal. Not at my disposal, but I've got access to a terrain of individuals that is completely saturated, right, with lived experience, authority, and wisdom. And that's what I'm trying to map out, right? I'm not trying to shoot anyone down or anything like that. I'm just trying to illuminate an area, and illuminate an area that's, you said it before, being forgotten about. And it's funny you use that word, forgotten, because the title of my study is Made Good and Stayed Good, which is a little nod towards making good. Because if we delve into like the intricacies of the English language, making good is an assumption. Made good and stayed good is a fact. How did you do it? But my previous title before Made Good and Stayed Good was The Forgotten Investment of Criminal Justice.
Have you gleaned any early insights, Paul, when you've looked at, as you said, folks who have made good and stayed good, that sort of differentiated? Well, there's the process of, if I could use a crude analogy, sort of, there's a difference between getting clean and staying clean. It's in the maintenance aspect of it, if you will. When you've examined and when you've interviewed those individuals who have passed that 5-year mark and they're in the 10, 20, 30-year mark, are there any patterns or themes or characteristics or insights you've learned from what it looks like once they get to those sort of temporal benchmarks?
So what I did was I interviewed everyone for about 90 minutes each. And I spoke to them and I said, this is going to be no different to you speaking at a Narcotics Anonymous convention. I just want you to share your experience, strength and hope with me. The first section, we're going to talk about what did it used to be like for you before you'd even thought about desistance and recovery. The second portion would be, okay, what happens to inspire you to make that leap of faith and search for this gift of recovery? And then the final section is, what's it like now, which is the section that sort of examines what's it been like for you after the 5-year points. What's transpired in your life? How's your life evolved? How's it different? In what ways is it different? What made it different? What did you have to do? What did you face? What did you encounter? How did you navigate it? And in doing all that, how have you been able to stay abstinent through all that? The what did it used to be like? Not trying to rewrite the wheel. There's a plethora of literature out there about it, so it's just got like four themes, because I believe the themes are set out in a logical order. I believe our backgrounds, the chief instigator of who we become in teenage years. Okay, so background's the first one. And your background has got a lot to do with how your cognition develops. So that's the second one. Then in comes criminality. It might just be robbing 3 cans of soda out of the 7-Eleven because you want to be part of Joseph's crew. So what I mean? Right? And then you get that euphoric sensation of like getting away with something and impressing your mates, and you want to do something more extreme next time. And then obviously it leads into your little soiree with substances. So substance use is the last one. The second section, again, there's a logical order in my opinion. Nothing happens without throwing the towel in or raising a white flag. Period. That has to be the first theme in the what happens section. The second theme is support. So whether that's initially within an intervention setting like a treatment centre or a recovery home, which will tend to direct you to one of the fellowships for you to get extracurricular support from like-minded people. Okay, so the second theme is support. The third theme is hope. Being exposed to such a saturated terrain of lived experience, authority and wisdom.
Yeah.
People who've walked a mile in your shoes, whose experience and wisdom you cannot discount because you just can't. You just know when someone's experienced what you've experienced, and you know when someone is trying to convince you that they understand what you've gone through when they haven't been through it, which is an issue that makes a lot of people rebellious with practitioners, etc. So from the hope that develops with exposure to these people, there starts to develop an element of stability in your recovery, early recovery. So then the third section is, what did it used to be like? What's it like now? The themes that I'm exploring is, the first one is consistency. So in order to reach 5 years, if you are not consistent with the disciplines and practices you've been applying to your life, you are not getting to 5 years. My daughter said to me a couple of years ago, she went, "Do you still have to go to them meetings?" So I said, well, I don't have to go nowhere. I said, think about this, kid. Do you want me to be that wretched creature that you bumped into in 2009 in town? I said, do you want to see that person again? She went, no, absolutely not. I said, well, if I keep going to these meetings, that guy's not going to come back. And she went, don't stop then.
Paul, as you spoke, you talked about, the value added of giving exposure to individuals with lived experience. And I wonder, do you think that is sort of the next frontier? I can tell you from where I sit, I'm starting to see movement in that direction where correctional agencies, human service agencies are seeing what assets individuals such as yourself are. And I'm just wondering and hoping maybe that's a role of those forgotten individuals, is as mentors and sort of ambassadors of hope, which I would contend is sorely lacking in the field right now, because it is ultimately the words of those individuals who've walked that pathway out of criminality that resonate the most. And I just think it's such an untapped resource that we're not leveraging, particularly in this day and age of limited budgets and exploding probation and parole caseloads. We have this sort of community in the wings just waiting to come in and share their experience and make all of our jobs a lot easier. Do you think we're to the point where we're past sort of the bias and the stigma that agencies will start exploring those opportunities?
I think it's not. I think what I've noticed is that, there's a huge upsurge of interest by the state and its partner agencies to utilise these lived experience, right?
Yeah.
There's the academic critic in me coming out now, right? Because they've metricised and intellectualised themselves out. They can't come up with anything different. Year by year, right, the figures are not going the way they were intended to go. They're starting to utilise lived experience now. They're starting to place value. I mean, I'm part of a collective here in the UK advocating for more appreciation and better rights towards lived experience. Okay, and they're trying to sort of employable value on their experiential wisdom and their lived experience authority. I mean, and there's a lot of opportunities opening up for a lot of people. They're always looking for lived experience now, which is something like when I was in the thick of it, it was just, nah, because what? I mean, Joseph, in 2021, I was working in a prison that I used to be a customer in. I had a badge and I had a belt and keys and all that. Oh, you with me? Right?
Yeah.
I remember going to this lad's cell one day because I'd just got my scholarship. I'd just secured me a fully funded PhD scholarship. So I'd handed me notice in. So all the lads on the landing, a lot of them who I've been nipped, who I've been on the landing with, and a couple I've been cellmates with. I remember I come on the wing and one of the screws said to me, such and such wants you down in the cell. And I went, what? He said, I've been told to tell you when you come on the wing that you wanted in cell 216. And it's all right, sounds. I said, I'll go down in a minute. Let me have a cup of tea. So this officer said, no, you can't have a cup of tea. He needs you to go right now. I said, listen, it was winter. I said, I'm freezing. I need a hot drink. He went, listen, just go down. It'll just take you 2 minutes. And I've gone down there, walked down, and all the lads who were sort of like on the landing, it was like a rehab wing. They'd all chipped in out of the canteen and that and got like a cake. Do you know what I mean? I've got like little cakes and biscuits, got like a little spread together for me. And wanted to give me a little send-off party. Do you know what I mean? So I went like that to walk in the cell. And there was a civilian, so you've got like the conventional prison officers, we call them screws, who were in the uniforms.
Yeah.
And then you've got the civvy screws, who are like contract workers to deliver some sort of interventions, whatever it is. So remember, I went to walk in this cell, and there was this like screw with this civvy, and he turned around, he went, listen, he went, Paul, you can't walk in the cell. I went, what? He said, we're strongly advised never to enter the prisoner's cells on our own. It's not a wise move. And I just turned around and I said, maybe for you it isn't. And he said, what's that supposed to mean? I said, I feel safer in here with these than I do out here with you. And he just looked at me like that. And I just went in the cell, sat down with them, had a bit of a laugh with them. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
But
that's a great story.
Even though I'd moved on in my life and I was about to leave, you know, I'd been delivering groups to them. They knew I was like 15 years clean. They all remembered me from when I was out there and when I was on the landings. And I had like a good rapport with them. So does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense.
I still had that, like, it weren't a case of like, you know, us and them. And I'd sort of emigrated to them and cast them to one side. They still viewed me as one of them.
Yeah. That's a fascinating look at what you just described, that phenomenon of that us versus them. And when folks make that transition, it's just fascinating to see people's reactions. So
consistency is the first one. I'm going to be looking at maturation. Now, maturation, for me, maturation is the big one, right? That challenges the stable recovery benchmark.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just give you a couple of examples of like comments. Okay. So Leon turned around and he said to me, I've grown and developed into my recovery process across the years. In the first 5 years, I was still terrified that the initial obsession and compulsion to use would or could return to haunt me again. Being shown the way to overcome that through the 12-step program opened my mind. Today, I've come to a different understanding of who I am as an individual. So that's one person.
Yeah.
Here's one of the girls. She turned around and she said, I've been different at different points. And when I look back at 5, 10 and the 15-year marks, I've matured on a mental and an emotional level. I'm more relaxed and I've slowed down. I do not take things so seriously anymore. I'm a more avid reader and I have a lot more quiet time in my life today. More so now, especially, than at 10 years and even more compared with 5 years. I just keep going and I'm still learning.
Wow.
Okay, here's the last one. This is off another girl. For example, both of my closest friends are in recovery. However, when we're out, we don't talk recovery. We talk about everyday normal things like clothes, what's happening in the world, because we've all matured and found balance. We know when it's right and when it's necessary to talk about recovery and when it's not. This is a skill that takes many years to develop.
I love that. This is a skill that takes many years to develop, which is something that practitioners and policymakers really struggle with because they're laboring under this delusion that desistance is like flipping a light switch. It's this on-off type process. And as you are well aware, it's not that linear. And I love the fact, Paul, that you're embracing Shadd's theme with looking at people's scripts, as he would say, whether they're the redemption scripts or the condemnation scripts. I love utilizing those even in my work, training and consulting, and sharing the actual words of desisted individuals, which I have found in my experience resonate and they're so much more impactful than a bar chart with X's and O's of statistics. Because when I when I read the quotes, just like those last 3 quotes that you just read from actual individuals to practitioners, I could just see the head nodding. Oh, yeah, I've heard this on my caseload. I've heard this from my clients. I heard this in a group I was running. And then that really clicks with them, and it makes it relatable, for lack of a better term, and they can see it more clearly in a sort of 3-dimensional lens.
The state and its practices are still somewhat anchored to the just say no perspective, right?
Yeah.
And if they can just say no, the problems just flitter away. Now, myself personally, I started putting substances in my body when I was a teenager, and I didn't stop until I was 45 years old. Even though I'd grown up physically, mentally and emotionally, I was still an adolescent.
Yeah.
Now, the thing about stories, I mean, people don't remember bar charts and metrics, okay?
Right.
People remember stories that carry meaning, okay? Here's an example, okay? Would I be wrong in assuming, because you're just like me, that you haven't read Jack and the Beanstalk cover to cover since you were 5 years old?
Right.
But you still remember what it means.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it had meaning.
Yeah.
As a 5-year-old, it carried meaning. It carried meaning. You might have read it for your grandkids, but that's just like way out of left field example, right? That people's stories have meaning, right? And people remember stories that are really dark and dramatic and impactful. And that's the experiential authority of lived experience in action.
Yeah, and that's why it's so powerful. Yeah, that's why it's so powerful. Paul, if there's a message you could send to well, let me ask you 2 final questions here. First, we'll try to get our word out to the listeners who are practitioners in the field. Many of them, particularly if they're regular listeners of this show, are familiar with desistance and the research around desistance, but the struggle might be more about how to put it into practice come Monday morning when they sit down with their client across the desk from them. So from your perspective, somebody with lived experience, someone who's desisted.
Someone who's still desisting, you mean?
You're still desisting. Thank you for correcting me. Exactly. You're still, as someone who is still desisting, Paul, what's a message you would give to a practitioner, something that they can start doing, whether it's considering someone's identity or taking into account the value of belonging or listening to someone's story? What's something that maybe someone who's going by the current risk, needs, responsivity playbook, but wants to start sort of doing desistance, if you will, what's something that they could throw into their repertoire?
What I would say is, right, there are 2 sides to every coin. Both sides of the coin have got meaning. Respect both sides. One side's not more important than the other. Do you know what I mean? So the practitioner side is not more important than the service user side. That's what advice I'd give them. Never think what you know is more important or has more meaning than what the other person's got to say.
I love that. I love getting folks with lived experience on the show, but I often will make the comment that, well, you're the true subject matter expert, the folks with lived experience. I can have all the certificates and degrees and whatnot, but I've never walked that pathway out of criminality, Paul. So again, we need to rely on those true subject matter experts. If someone is listening, maybe Paul, who's in that early recovery stage or they're in that first 5-year window, what's some advice you would give to those individuals trying to continue desisting, if you will?
Find someone to walk this path with you, because you're going to need someone to lean on. The path to desistance can be a lonely journey. The best path to desistance is one that you've got company on.
Paul, keep us up to date with your research. I know you and I will stay in touch, but I would love to have you back and talk some more about the journey of continued desistance, if you will. Paul Doke, thank you so much for joining us on the Criminologist Podcast today.
My pleasure. Good luck, everyone.
Thanks, Paul. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Paul Doke as much as I did. We spend a lot of time on this show talking about desistance from crime, how it begins, what drives it, and how we as practitioners can support it. But what Paul brings to the conversation is something both powerful and, frankly, too often overlooked. A focus not just on how people desist, but how they continue desisting over time. That subtle shift in language matters. Not desisted, but desisting. Because as Paul reminds us, this is not a fixed state. It's an ongoing, dynamic process, one that unfolds across years, even decades. I was also struck by his reframing of Narcotics Anonymous and similar fellowships. Historically, many of us in the field, myself included, have been somewhat dismissive of 12-step programs when viewed through a narrow definition of what counts as a, quote, evidence-based practice. But Paul challenges us to look deeper, to see that the real value may not lie in the structure of the program alone, but in the fellowship, the belonging, the identity transformation, and the sharing of hopeful stories that those communities foster. And that aligns directly with what we know about desistance from crime. People change not just through programs, but through relationships, meaning, and connection. And perhaps most remarkable of all, Paul himself was once a participant in Shadd Maruna's original Liverpool Desistance Study. And now, years later, he is contributing to that same body of knowledge, this time as a researcher, a scholar, a voice helping us better understand what it means to make good and stay good. It is really a small world in our desistance community at times, but more importantly, it's a reminder of what's possible. So as you reflect on today's episode, I'll leave you with this. What would change in our work if we focused not only on helping people stop offending, but on helping them build and sustain a new identity over time? And if you are interested in learning more about how to begin applying these concepts in your own caseloads or within your agencies, I would invite you to check out our TIDES supervision model. TIDES, of course, is short for Trauma-Informed Desistance. You can visit our website at thetidesllc.com. That's thetidesllc.com. Or feel free to reach out to me directly through the podcast. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
I said, they're inadvertently rubber stamping 5 years as you are fixed and pushing back out into the world. I said, and it's sort of justified and backed up by Shapland and Bottoms, right, who suggest that, like, at 5 years, you can leave the desistance cycle and adopt your transformed crime-free identity, as though the stuff that happened to you prior didn't even happen to you. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, that just sounds so ridiculous to me. I said, I don't like it.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, training opportunities, program design, or interview requests, visit theparagongroup.llc.com. To learn more about the TIDES supervision model, a trauma-informed, desistance-based approach to community supervision, please visit the tidesllc.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to check out the Criminologist YouTube channel for additional content, including exclusive video interviews and international insights. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Don't forget to give the show a 5-star review. And as always, thank you for listening.